Welcome, I'm Rose Aguilar, and this is Your Call. About 6 months ago, I ran across a very interesting podcast called Conspirituality. The hosts, Matthew Remski, Beres, and Julian Walker, do a great job of explaining and analyzing cults, disinformation in the wellness community, COVID conspiracy theories, and authoritarian extremism. Their recent podcasts explore why RFK Jr. joined the Trump campaign and the Make America Healthy Again movement. I also appreciate their focus on actual political solutions to public health problems, especially for people living in low-income communities, rather than individual solutions, which is the focus of so many in the wellness community. Matthew Remski, Beres, and Julian Walker launched the Conspirituality podcast in 2020 in response to the COVID misinformation that was running rife throughout the wellness world. In June of last year, they released a book called Conspirituality: How New Age Conspiracy Theories Became a Health Threat. They write, at best, the conspirituality movement attacks public health efforts in time of crisis. At worst, it fronts and recruits for the fever dream of QAnon as the alt-right and New Age horseshoe toward each other in a blur of disinformation. Clear discourse and good intentions get smothered. Many of the people in this movement support RFK Jr., who's joined the Trump campaign. So how big is the Make America Healthy Again movement, and how is it affecting the election and the future of public health science? Beres writes about science and the pseudoscience of alternative health grifts. He's exposed how wellness influencers, most of them not certified in nutritional sciences, capitalize on bodily dysmorphia to promote certain foods and demonize others while overlooking the reality that many people do not have access to healthy food in the first place. His work has been featured in many publications, including Time and Rolling Stone. He just started Cirrus Health, a nonprofit that brings together health and science experts to inform, educate, and dismantle misinformation. Hi, Derek. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hey, Rose. Thank you so much for having us.
Great to have you. Julian Walker has been writing critically about New Age spirituality, gurus, and Western yoga culture since 2004. His writing has been featured in many publications, including Elephant Journal and the 2011 book, 21st Century Yoga. Julian teaches yoga and runs teacher training programs in and around Los Angeles. Hi, Julian. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here, Rose.
Matthew Remski spent many years in two spiritual cults. He writes about spiritual delusion and possibility in the shadows of capitalism and climate change. He has published 9 books of poetry, fiction, and nonfiction. His 2019 book, Practice and All is Coming: Abuse, Cult Dynamics, and Healing in Yoga and Beyond, analyzes pervasive cultism in the modern yoga world. His latest book is Surviving Modern Yoga: Cult Dynamics, Charismatic Leaders, and What Survivors Can Teach Us. Hi, Matthew. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, Rose. Thank you.
Well, it's so good to have you all. I've been listening to you for about 6 months. I wish I would have found you sooner, but thank you for the great work that you do, especially right now. I read that the three of you met as bloggers back in 2011. You read each other's work, you talked about and debated all of these issues. And Derek, at the end of April 2020, you published an explainer piece on a new term you came across, conspirituality. So can you start? What does this mean exactly, conspirituality?
The term was coined in 2011, so it wasn't completely new, but it really hadn't reached any mainstream attention. And it basically signifies this strange sort of crossover between predominantly left-leaning people who like New Age practices and wellness, and right-wing conservative, but even sometimes more extreme libertarian politics. And the authors posited that it has resurfaced usually times during cultural confusion, or, the last time they said it was in the late 1960s when civil rights and feminism was going on. And you have this blurring of lines between these ideologies. And that is essentially what the term signifies.
It is such an interesting time because there's so much out there. I love learning about health. And there's so many new YouTube shows and books and even doctors going down a lot of these rabbit holes. So, Julian, why don't you talk a little bit about why you all decided to come together to first put this podcast together and then write an entire book about conspirituality?
Well, the idea for the podcast really was something that we thought would be no more than, one or two episodes just examining this new phenomenon as we watched our social media feeds get taken over by conspiracy theories that were really outrageous and sort of, as Derek mentioned, trending in the direction of QAnon. And then also having the kind of spiritual overlay that not only was there this QAnon fever dream about pedophile blood drinking elites and Trump being a light worker and the election being this incredibly pivotal moment politically and in terms of that conspiracy theory, but also the New Age piece that we were heading towards a great awakening that would be about a spiritual transformation into the fifth dimension of light and love. And so as we were observing all of this, we just said, wow, this dovetails with a lot of the work we know we've each been doing over the years on cults and on certain types of prophetic belief systems, like the 2012 prophecy that the world was going to be forever changed or maybe end due to the Mayan calendar. So let's have a conversation about this. And we did it, and the audience response was overwhelming. And so we said, let's do another, and that just kept going because sadly, this fringe phenomenon that we started off tracking has now become the norm and very much mainstream.
And Matthew, you come at this from a very interesting background. You spent years in two spiritual cults. And I really appreciate when you talk on the podcast about how you don't want to demonize people or make fun of people because so many people are seeking something bigger. And you make a point that what is happening is people are really being exploited and they have real concerns. So talk a bit about that. I just really appreciate you saying people are getting wrapped up in all of this, but the approach to it is not to make fun of them or laugh at them. I just really appreciate that.
Well, I'm glad that that comes through. I think it's really essential when we're talking about folks who are drawn into what seem to be contradictory beliefs or, ritual practices that don't serve them or communities that actually don't have their best interests at heart. But I think that the reality is that we're all not so far away from those social vortexes as we would like to think, especially in an era of, social fragmentation, institutional distrust, really good reasons that people have for checking out of political and community building discourse altogether. And I just feel that, conspirituality is also a type of yearning that we might call a vestige of a real religious impulse that is alienated from perhaps heritage, from community, from practice, and thrown into this online sort of, what do you call it with the lottery balls, the tumbler, where you never quite know what you're going to get, but everything that you're going to get points towards this fantasy that you might hit it big, and of course everything is also monetized, and I also say that anybody who gets drawn into a kind of spiritualized version of healthism or anti-vax, rhetoric, that they're going to come out of it through sources of social support, not just through being shown the science or being told how to critically think, much less by being told that they're idiots or they're gullible or fools. So we really try to make sure that we take that approach, I think.
I think it's important also to remember what happened during COVID In your book, you write, on the vaccine front, history will show that the COVID response was a wonder of global innovation and adaptation. But the news fog through which it was first told was garbled with amplified panic over exceedingly rare side effects. While well meaning researchers and scientists were constantly working to keep up with the evolving science and offer the best assessments they could with the evidence at hand, social media was working in binaries to punish anything perceived as flip-flopping. This gave everyone who was already on the edge of institutional distrust a boost of validation and a broader demographic to engage. Derek, can you just remind us what really happened under COVID with misinformation? And it's just so sad because I lost my cousin. Unfortunately, she got wrapped up in a tent revival church, and she was taking video actually of the service. People were coughing, no one was wearing masks. And from her deathbed, she put on Facebook that vaccines contained aborted fetal cells. So many of us are so close to this. Can you just remind us just how much misinformation was spread during COVID, how it started and then how it's still with us to this day?
And it was with us before COVID. And in fact, the first anti-vaxxers emerged at the time when Edward Jenner and Louis Pasteur were proving the efficacy of vaccines in the first place. And when you had referenced earlier when introducing us, when we had started a blog back in 2012, which was called Yoga Brains, and we were talking about some of these topics then, but there wasn't as much attention focused on, well, what could be wrong with the anti-science rhetoric that wellness influencers are spreading, because there was no real audience for it outside of brick and mortar yoga studios. Well, fast forward almost a decade and you have a much larger audience for them to spread this misinformation. And one of the complaints that they had, and I would say a lot of figures on the right had at the time as well, and that's part of the crossover, is that the public health messaging was poor and that the infrastructures weren't set up to understand these sorts of pandemics or viruses, when in reality, if you had some foundation in public health or understanding of medicine, you would realize that these institutions actually do exist. They had existed for generations, and they were doing the work behind the scenes to try to get across the best information at that time. Now, it wasn't always perfectly delivered, and there were problems, of course, but the misinformation was being spread because the people who were spreading it had moneyed interests in selling supplements, in selling courses, in confusing and creating institutional distrust. And that's something that has been happening for a very long time. But when people are locked down and their only recourse is to turn to their phones and they no longer have the social networks to communicate with one another, everything was amplified and in your face. And depending on where you get your information from, if you didn't have a really good news diet or science diet to begin with, it was so easy to get sucked into these misinformation pipelines.
Rose, Julian
Yes.
here, if I can just roll off that, if you
Please.
don't mind. I think one of the crucial things to say here is that there are actual conspiracies. There is outrageous corruption in which governments and corporations have lied to and harmed ordinary people.
Yeah.
There really are secretive groups behind the scenes that manipulate the levers of power. But once you've correctly perceived that, then I think the next question is, on each specific case, what are you going to base your beliefs on? Are you going to seek out the highest quality investigative journalism, the strongest scientific evidence? Are you going to look at the most carefully reasoned arguments? Or will you go on vibes and generalizations and the persuasion of charismatic influence? And that's where we see this intersection where the wellness, the spirituality, the sort of more cultish influencers were able to plug into that legitimate kind of concern about the realities of real conspiracies and corruption and people not really feeling well taken care of by their government, for example, through their messaging, which was largely evidence-free.
Rose,
I'm glad
I
you brought
also
this.
have
Oh,
something.
go ahead, Matthew.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to add that is that one of the ways in which those influencers were able to do it was that they were able to affect a kind of authorization with regard to their followers that actually runs antithetically to the way in which public science is done. So if there are stops and starts, if there are corrections in the public health officer's information, that's an indication to the demographic that we were studying that, you know, these are people who don't really know themselves. They don't really know what's going on. They're going in fits and starts. They don't have the kind of, you know, self-born certainty that we enjoy from our spiritual practices. And so one of the big influences that we saw was that the actual charismatic seller of the spiritual cure or the anti-vax formula was using a kind of certainty and, I don't know, like epistemological pride to basically say, you know, we know what health actually means. We know what it feels like. You can't tell us that we are asymptomatically sick because we know ourselves. It's very insulting, actually, to this population to be told that they don't know everything there is to know about their own bodies, which they've been treating like the temple of God for so many years. So that was not part of this, that demographic could not listen to the unfolding of scientific, you know, processes with any kind of patience.
I'm glad you bring this up because we've had a number of government watchdogs on our show who talk about raising awareness about you name the issue, whether it's at the EPA or around oil and gas and their shutdown. So here's a recent story by Sharon Lerner at ProPublica. She does fantastic reporting. EPA scientists said they were pressured to downplay harms from chemicals. A watchdog found they were retaliated against. So all of this is very legitimate. And you do write this in your book, that these good faith yearnings in a burning world point to a core reason that conspirituality is so stressful to the communities it enchants, and a key reason why the three of us have been as obsessed with deconstructing it. The reason is conspiritualists are not wrong. They are attuned to our systemic problems. So you have the piece I just put up there, talked about there, and then I just looked up these numbers from the CDC. 6 in 10 Americans have at least one chronic disease. 4 in 10 have 2 or more chronic diseases. We're talking about heart disease, diabetes, stroke, obesity. I just read that my generation, Generation X, is going to have far more cancer than my dad's generation, the baby boomers. So there are so many crises out there, legitimate crises. So can you talk about that, Derek, that a lot of people actually do have legitimate reasons to be angry, skeptical, whatever word you want to use. As you say, a lot of these people are not wrong.
Oh, absolutely. And the book that I published before Conspirituality was critical of the pharmaceutical industry when it comes to certain mental health interventions. So we're sometimes referred to as like shills for big pharma, but saying vaccinations work, but you can say vaccinations work, and you can also be critical of the healthcare industry and the pharmaceutical industries, which we really try to be. And that sort of pain and confusion is real. What I think I know personally in my work and what we try to bring to the pod is the understanding and the identification that when these wellness influencers pretend to put forward science when it's not actually evidence-based and it's all based on feelings and vibes, they're not actually looking at clinical evidence, and they're also not really addressing what could help population health. And the conflation between individual health and public health or population health is something they often do. And I know at the beginning you flagged MAHA, which is Make America Healthy Again, Bobby Kennedy's platform right now under the larger umbrella of MAGA at this moment. And everything they offer is individual health solutions. But if you actually talk to people who have spent their life studying this, you need to start upstream with public health solutions. The problem is that wellness influencers cannot monetize those. If you're going to talk about the social determinants of health and alleviating poverty and helping people get access to healthcare and helping people not go medically bankrupt, because there's up to 500,000 Americans every year who have to claim bankruptcy due to medical bills, you can't sell anything that addresses those solutions. And that's where all of what we're discussing, or at least what, when it comes to health specifically, gets really jumbled in people's minds, because they take individual health solutions and they think that, oh, if you give someone a gym membership, or oh, if they only eat organic food, all of these chronic diseases are going to magically disappear. And on an individual basis, sure, some people go to the gym, lose weight, and they're healthier, and that is absolutely wonderful. But what Maha is doing is they're taking population health statistics, like all of those which you just cited, which are correct, and they're trying to apply individual solutions that won't actually make a dent in them. And that, I think, is one of the biggest problems and the illusion that they're creating right now around health in general.
Rose, can I just add that if we're going to talk about Bobby Kennedy a little bit more, he really embodies everything that Derek is just mentioning. Like, within his person, his presentation, his performance of politics, he really sort of brings the entire ethos of individual health to the forefront, right down to like a major sort of campaign image is going to be me working out shirtless at Gold's Gym in my jeans, and out on walks with my dogs, and doing falconry and stuff like that, and doing chin-ups, but at the same time taking TRT, and at the same time pushing supplement sales and things like that. And then when he conjoins that sort of very embodied strongman, vigorous thing with his own sort of spiritual beliefs, you really get the essence of conspirituality, because what you have is somebody who is presenting his personal spiritual journey as somehow emblematic of, or transformational with regard to the population. Like, through him, and his followers often will talk about him that way, that through him and his inspiration, if we can sort of connect to our inner Bobby Kennedy, that we will sort of transform the health system. Meanwhile, what he's actually talking about is destroying all of the agencies and locking up doctors who prove their science through evidence-based research.
Well, I was going to ask you about this, because given that you have done so much reading and just watching the Maha movement, Make America Healthy Again, is anyone talking about the fact that Trump was one of the most corporate captured presidents ever, and that industry runs these government institutions, and it's all about deregulation? Have any of these basic questions come up in any of these Maha conversations?
No.
Simply put.
What you'll see in Bobby Kennedy's followers, but this is translated down to the level of, people who are boosting him, who have to decide what they're going to do once he endorses Trump. People like Charles Eisenstein, the New Age writer who was his messaging director for a while. What you'll see is division in the comments, where some people will say, hey, wait a minute, Trump is the most captured person on the planet. This has nothing to do with Bobby's message. But then the spiritual answer for that is, no, Trump is not who we think he is. He's actually a disruptive gateway, by which the greater message of Maha can be communicated. And so Kennedy, if you'll notice, does a fair bit to kind of keep himself at arm's length from Trump's most obvious characteristics, while telling his followers that actually this is just an opportunity, the disruptive opportunity that we need to, bring about this public transformation of health and spirituality.
If you want to understand what's really going on, and I implore any listener to do this, look at Ron Johnson's voting record when it comes to SNAP and school lunches and housing for poor people, because he is the person who brought the Maha panel to Congress. If you want to match what Bobby Kennedy says Maha will do if he gets a cabinet position, match it against what he said he'll do a year ago to the CDC and HHS, which is basically deregulate it, and match it against what Project 2025 says it will do to the agencies that can actually enforce the things that Maha says they're going to do. And you'll see the contradiction laid out right before you. Unfortunately, actually doing that sort of policy work and reading those documents is a heavier lift than most people will do than if you see a meme about Fruit Loops on social media. And those memes are very effective, even if they're false, because the information they're presenting aren't even true, but people don't sometimes take the time to go and actually look up the policies about these things. And that's what we try to do on the podcast, is actually go read those policies and then talk to people about them to let them know what's actually going on.
And Rose, the really, really bitter irony here, as we've been discussing for the last couple of minutes, is that you have this group of influencers showing up at the Senate roundtable hosted by Ron Johnson with RFK Jr. as the sort of main figure, all seemingly calling for agency reform, for regulation of the food supply and of and the chemicals in the soil, et cetera, largely based on a lot of very dodgy evidence, while they're being introduced with their website bios and where you can go to buy their products. While this whole group is throwing their weight behind the MAGA movement, where, as Derek has said, Project 2025 actively wants to dismantle the very agencies that these folks seem to be doing, that they're doing a kind of theatrical calling out to for some kind of regulatory support. It's the whole thing is just a shambles. And it really is what you've been mentioning, relying on people's legitimate concerns and fears, but offering false explanations for what's really going on and false solutions to the problems.
We're going to take a quick break. Today, we're joined by Matthew Remski, Derek Beres, and Julian Walker. We're talking about their podcast, Conspirituality, which they launched in 2020 in response to COVID misinformation that was running rife throughout the wellness world, and their book, which came out last year, Conspirituality, How New Age Conspiracy Theories Became a Health Threat. So many people in this movement support Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's joined the Trump campaign. You've probably heard about the Make America Healthy Again movement. We'll talk about how big it is, how it's affecting the election and public health science. And if you'd like to join us, is this speaking to you? And again, no judgment. If you... I know a lot of environmentalists who loved Robert F. Kennedy's work, all the lawsuits that he filed. He's done a lot of great work, and people were shocked when he joined the Trump campaign. So what are your thoughts? If you've been following Make America Healthy Again, what do you think about it? If you go on a lot of health podcasts or listen to YouTube shows, what are your thoughts? Just so much has really changed in the last 4 years. You can give us a call at 866-798-8255. You can also email your call at kalw.org. We'll be back after this. This is Your Call. I'm Rose Aguilar. Coming up on our Media Roundtable tomorrow, we'll be joined by longtime radio host Tom Hartman. We'll talk about coverage of the election and his latest piece, U.S. Fascism Has Arrived, thanks to 30 years of right-wing talk radio. Then we'll discuss a Texas monthly investigation about the misinformation network profiting off the invasion narrative. Former intelligence officers and ex-feds are spreading propaganda and laying the groundwork for presidential election challenges. We hope you can join us tomorrow. And then again on election night, I hope that you can join us. We will do a live broadcast at 111 Minna in San Francisco at 7 p.m. We'd love to see you there. You can find information at kalw.org. Today, we are joined by Matthew Remski, Derek Beres, and Julian Walker. They are co-hosts of a really great podcast called Conspirituality. They do a great job of explaining and analyzing cults, disinformation in the wellness community, the merging of wellness and right-wing politics. And recently, they've been exploring why RFK Jr. joined the Trump campaign and the Make America Healthy Again movement. If you'd like to join us, if any of this speaks to you, or if you're just confused because there's so much out there right now, you can give us a call at 866-798-8255. You can also email your call at kalw.org. I don't know if you can even answer this question, but Derek, is there any way of knowing how big the Make America Healthy Again movement is? How many people have gone with RFK over to Trump?
There's no way to quantify it specifically. Those numbers are really hard. We can look at some polling data that RFK was doing, which wasn't very high. But I think the bigger concern from my perspective is that he at least pulled over some of the wellness space that we're talking about, the people who were on board with his messaging. And at this point, given how close this race is, I would say any sort of impact is not going to be good. It's going to go over into the Trump column. I do not expect that a lot of RFK fans would become a Harris voter after he dropped out. I expect they would either not vote, perhaps go over to Jill Stein, or go with Bobby. And we've at least seen in the comment sections and the reactions, especially because he's sort of rebranded his anti-vax brand as Maha now, that he has gained some traction. So it's not negligible to me, but I don't know if it's going to overall make an impact, but there will be some.
I'll just add, Rose, this is Matthew, that the rebranding to Maha is, I think, incredibly smart on Bobby's side. He opened his independent campaign saying over and over again to anybody who challenged him that he stood by his anti-vax history, but that he wasn't running on that. Well, that wasn't exactly true, but with Maha as kind of like a scattershot, all-encompassing umbrella that can suck in all kinds of food and health and pharmaceutical-related concerns, he's really set himself up to expand something that he does best, which is in interview, when he's challenged, he gish gallops. So when he's confined to vaccines, he'll go from one issue to another so that nothing ever really gets resolved. Well, when he broadens his content platform to Maha, he can actually jump from one subject to another. If vaccines doesn't really make headway for him, he can bounce to Fruit Loops or cloud seeding or chemtrails, which is something that they've recently entertained on his nonprofit website. So I think he's done a good job of actually diversifying what he's able to bring together.
Julian, for people who don't know just how big this space is, can you talk about that? Because like I said, I love learning about health. In fact, I followed some of the people that you criticize. I did not know about Dr. Christiane Northrup. I haven't followed her in a long time, but I just didn't know she went down the Q rabbit hole. That was pretty shocking for me to learn about. I mean, she was such a well-respected women's health doctor. But there are so many YouTube shows where doctors host the shows. They get millions of views. There's so many new books coming out. I mean, you could spend your entire day listening to health podcasts, and a lot of them are very good. But then, I mean, I actually watched The Food Babe for many years. I haven't in a while. This is a really interesting one I'd like for you to talk about. She was all about like red dye and chemicals, and saying that chemicals that are legal in the United States are not legal in Europe. And I just thought that was true for years until I started listening to you guys and then doing my reading based on what you said that the same chemicals are actually legal in Europe. They're just named something different. So it's just, this is so pervasive.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And what you're describing, Rose, is such a common experience. You're not alone in it. Like there are so many people who are in our general demographic, right? It's the person who's at Whole Foods with the yoga mat under their arm, and they're getting their veggie juice and then going out to their Prius. There's a real interest in health and wellness, taking good care of yourself. There's an interest in natural living. The wellness economy in the U.S. is valued at almost $2 trillion. So it's a really, really big sector. When you talk about the different YouTube channels and we talk about someone like Christiane Northrup came to prominence by being she identified herself as a feminist advocate for women's health, really addressing legitimate concerns that women had had for many decades about how they were treated within the healthcare system. And she wrote a very successful book about this that was a bestseller. And then over time, she found herself in this niche where the combination of her, I would speculate, the combination of her medical credentials and then her open-mindedness around a lot of alternative beliefs about both medicine and health and diet and supplements and essential oils, as well as her new age spiritual proclivities, meant that these things all sort of got blended together. And when the pandemic hit, what you found was Dr. Christiane Northrup sitting in her beautiful big house in the Northeast, doing a daily video sermon called the Great Awakening series, in which she was just repeating conspiracy theories about how COVID was a hoax, how it was being caused by 5G, how when the vaccines came, they were going to have, microchips in them that were going to control your brain, whatever the various things were, references to QAnon, references to extreme militia ideas about the importance of getting armed and knowing who your local sheriffs are and getting ready for the revolution that's going to come because vaccines represented an attempt to impose tyranny upon us. But then all of this would be woven together with, oh, have you tried this new supplement? It's really good if you're going through menopause, or this is going to help you if you want to have more energy. You should drink structured water. And by the way, look at this beautiful crystal that one of my followers sent me. I'm so grateful for it. Let's all gaze into it right now and think about the cosmic higher truths. So this is part of why the podcast started, because we were seeing the emergence of these overlaps.
She also played the harp.
That's right.
Well, to your point, I checked out her Twitter feed today, and it's wild. And in the middle of all of it, she is giving you 60% off for 7 energy centers at $80.
Yeah.
So I guess that the hard part about this is that, people are really wanting something, to find something, whether it's people who are kind of lost or have a mental health problem, or my loved one was recently diagnosed with cancer. I have so many horrible stories to share about what the food is like in the hospital, the doctors not even remembering what he did yesterday. Everybody's got stories like this. And so we're all kind of yearning for help. We just want someone to help our loved one or help ourselves. So it's so easy to get caught up in all of this.
Yes, Rose. And I want to say, too, that, you referenced in line with everything you just said, off the top, you referenced the statistics on chronic illness, and you listed, diabetes and cardiovascular disease, et cetera. What people like Bobby Kennedy will do, they'll take that statistic on chronic disease, which is a real problem, and they'll sort of misleadingly make it apply to things like obesity or to things like autoimmune conditions and chronic illnesses that people have that are actually much more rare. And then he'll say, well, if you think about it, it's really obvious. This is because of the food we eat. This is because of the chemicals in the soil. This is because the government is not protecting us. This is because of the vaccines. And so there's a sleight of hand that goes on that if you're not paying attention, all sounds very feasible. It sounds very plausible, especially if you're someone who identifies as believing in natural living and as wanting to engage in health practices that will, be sort of taking responsibility for treating your body like a temple, as Matthew said earlier. And so then from there, let me present you with these solutions. And as you said, everyone, or so many people, are looking for solutions. They're looking for ways to feel empowered. And that is what snake oil salesmen always rely on. I've got the cure for what ails you. Evidence, pish paw, that's the mainstream trying to keep you away from the things that will really empower you and set you free and help you wake up.
We have a number of people emailing us saying, how do you then know what to believe? And I just wonder, listening to your podcast and reading some of the pieces that you've written, Derek, with your new nonprofit, Cirrus Health, for example, I wonder, are you afraid that you might be going to the point where people just don't believe anything? Because of my loved one with cancer, I've just been knee deep in information about cancer. And there's so much good research out there. I mean, the CDC does have information about obesity associated cancers in the United States. I mean, the Mayo Health Clinic using a plant-based diet or mostly plants to lower your cancer risk. I can go on and on. I mean, the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, dietary changes may help reduce cancer risk. So there's good science out there. Are you ever concerned that you're asking people to become too skeptical to the point where they don't really believe anything?
No, that's not a concern. So thank you for citing it's Cyrus Health. It's named after
Osiris.
My cat Osiris, who passed when he was almost 22. But as a cancer survivor myself, I take that seriously, particularly out of all of the range of diseases that wellness influencers talk about. So when someone says you can cure cancer or treat it with these reishi mushrooms or these juice cleanses, it really triggers me. But here's a heuristic that I use that I think is really helpful for people. When someone is saying something, go to their website or wherever their main place is where they convene online and read their bio, because medical professionals in the first paragraph will specifically state what they are and where they've trained. You will never see that. Usually with wellness influencers, what you're going to see is an anecdote about how they healed their gut or they healed something in their lives. And then sometimes you'll see some training. But even as you flagged earlier, you can say you're a nutritionist in America without any actual training. There are certain terms you can use. You can say you're a naturopath. You can say you're a nutritionist or nutrition informed. You can say you're trauma informed without actual training. And that's how people sort of get around the fact that they haven't actually done clinical training in any capacity. And so what we're doing with Cyrus Health is we're only working with medical professionals who have actual training and they don't speak outside of the scope of their practice. So you'll see sometimes a lot of fitness trainers who are really good at talking about anatomy and physiology, but then they throw on a nutrition plan that they're going to also sell to you. And they don't have any training in that. And you can see those sorts of conflations across the world. And you even identified earlier, it happens in medical spaces too. You will see people who are, say, a cardiologist, but all of a sudden they're talking about mental health, and that's outside of their scope of practice, but they feel confident selling things there. And we've talked about this the whole time, but it is really confusing. But I will at least say to people, if you want to learn about a topic, do that extra step of seeing their actual credentials. And one heuristic that I've had on the podcast is watch what they say and then watch what they sell. So if they're saying, I cured my cancer by this diet, and you can buy the diet plan from me, that's a big red flag.
Right.
And Rose, if I could add here, everything that you just said about looking at the actual research, looking at what the medical research centers have to say, looking at what is described as a good idea in terms of how you take care of yourself based on the research, that's all completely legitimate. One of the real problems, and we're part of this digital media phenomenon. One of the problems with digital media and with all of these YouTube channels and podcasts is there is nothing entertaining and there's nothing compelling and sticky to identify with in a podcast or YouTube channel that says, well, we're going to review what Harvard or what Sloan Kettering actually has to say about diet for today, and then we'll have covered that subject for now. There's nothing sexy about that. What is sexy is saying, here's the thing that they don't want you to know about. We've got 10 more episodes in the can where we're going to talk to these people who have different anecdotal stories about how they did this bizarre thing and it worked for them. And, Big Pharma doesn't want you to know about it. And that's the real difference. The difference is how strong is the evidence? How qualified, as Derek just said, are the people who are delivering it to you? What are they trying to sell you on the back end of what they're talking about?
Right.
Can I just add a very important social policy piece, which is that of all of the very difficult to pass proposals in the Harris platform, the thing that I think would make the most difference within this entire conversation is extending Medicare to home care. Because we can ask people to develop deeper critical thinking skills. We can ask them to take another step. And we also have to recognize that sometimes people are exhausted, or they will still find that is confusing or baffling, and they're still managing their, difficult bureaucratic lives. But I think one of the answers to institutional distrust is for institutions to give care. And I can't really sort of back this up with any solid data, but I do think that there is a reason why QAnon took off like wildfire in the United States and not in countries so much like where I am now in Canada with socialized medicine. When you live in a society that expresses a basic level of social safety, there is less need for this health libertarianism. There's less need to say, oh, I'm going to do it all myself, or there's less need to pretend that you're invulnerable, and then to try to find the influencer who will validate that for you through their magical plans. So I really think that there's a structural piece there that we want to pay a lot of attention to.
This is such a good point, because in addition to Medicare covering home care, it would also finally cover vision and hearing. Of course, Bernie Sanders has been wanting it to go much further, to cover dental. Can you imagine having this cover dental for the first time in this country? But that is such a good point. I think we have time. We're just getting a lot of emails from people saying, I listened to both shows and I'm so glad you have had them on. Jane says, I wish you would inaugurate a sporadic or as needed series on dangerous, societal, corrupting, gaslighting, and all the other rhetorical jive so prevalent today, connecting the abstract with the concrete, the theoretical with the practical. We all need to be reminded and on guard constantly. She wants to thank you all for your work. So thank you for that, Jane. Let's go to John in San Francisco. Hi, John. Thank you for holding. And we're almost out of time, John.
Hi, I'll make it quick. I had a very good friend who was into lots of health practices that are proven, like yoga and cycling and meditation, and would teach in all of those areas for decades, and then somehow got sucked into the supplement things and was suddenly selling some holistic hoo-ha stuff. And I was just wondering, I was shocked, and I was just wondering, because this is a smart guy, if that is a common story, if even people who should know better get sucked into the vortex.
Thanks,
I would
John.
say absolutely. Thanks, John. I would say absolutely. I taught at a chain of gyms called Equinox Fitness, and I taught cycling and yoga and a whole variety of modalities. And many of my colleagues were very smart and credible trainers, but some of them, it's so easy to fall into supplements pipelines in these spaces because they're prevalent, they're all over the place, and because there are magical promises attached to them. So, critical thinking in one area does not always transfer to other areas. And unfortunately, specifically in the fitness space, supplements are just infect a lot of the population.
They're also incredibly lucrative.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, John. And Matthew, I know you have to jump off right now. So thank you so much for joining us, and we'd love to have you back.
I'd love that. Thanks a lot, Rose.
Thank you. Matthew Remski spent years in 2 spiritual cults. You can find more about his work and his latest book, Surviving Modern Yoga, at kalw.org. Click news and then your call. Julian and Derek, about a minute left each. There are real life consequences to what's happening right now. Thanks to your work, I just found this story about the U.S. school entry vaccination rate falling as exemptions keep rising. This is the AP. U.S. kindergarten vaccination rates dipped last year, and the proportion of kids with exemptions rose to an all-time high. So there are real life consequences to all of this. What would you say concerns you the most? And how do you think this is going to affect the future of public health science? Derek, about a minute left.
I posted that particular story, and I'll say that that is one of my biggest concerns. It actually, kindergarten vaccination rates have dropped for 3 consecutive years in the US right now. And so it's always been my concern that someone doesn't seek actual care and instead goes to meditation workshops where they're told they can heal their own bodies. And you know what? Some people can, depending on what's going on, but you don't know that. And it's really important to seek people who know what they're talking about. And I know that's really challenging in America, where everything is for profit. And it's one of the paradoxes of this work, because even the many doctors and researchers I talk to regularly are frustrated with the system that we have. But I would still advocate for talking to someone who knows what they're talking about, not someone who's watched some YouTube videos and then is trying to repeat what they're saying and make money from it.
Julian, your final thoughts?
Rose, I'm so glad you brought up the plummeting vaccination rates. That is really, really alarming. As the father of a young child, I have skin in that game, more so than I might otherwise. And it has been something, sadly, that we've been predicting, because what happened with COVID contrarianism and a lot of anti-vax misinformation and disinformation, that people were profiting off by then driving sales in things like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine and other supplements and, health regimes. That all of that confusion about the safety and efficacy of vaccines has now led to people not only mistrusting the COVID vaccine, but mistrusting all vaccines. And when we're talking about children and about illnesses that we are so privileged to live in a society in which they don't kill and seriously injure the illnesses, children the way that they do in countries without the kind of infrastructure we have, it's just tragic that there are so many well-meaning people who have gotten sucked into believing that those vaccines are something they need to protect their kids from, when the diseases are the real threat.
Julian Walker and Derek Beres are co-hosts of the Conspirituality podcast and co-authors of the book, Conspirituality: How New Age Conspiracy Theories Became a Health Threat. Thank you so much for your work. We'd love to have you back.
Thank you, Rose.
Thank you, Rose.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us. I'm Rose Aguilar. It's your call.